Thank you for joining another wonderful Zoom at the Library Society. Most of us had never heard of Zoom 9 months ago, but it's proven to be a remarkably easy and wonderful platform to stay relevant and in touch with all of you. Although we're not gathering in the beautifully restored main reading room at the Library Society, I want to remind all of our audience that the Library Society is America's second oldest circulating library and the oldest cultural institution in the South. It was founded in 1748 when we were a colony under King George III. Almost all of South Carolina's leaders, as well as George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, were members of the Library Society. So if you're not a member, you should join, because this is the kind of outstanding programming we do. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Jeffrey Jackson, who probably can appreciate Lafayette's membership here, since he teaches courses in modern European history, cultural history, French history, environmental studies, and interdisciplinary studies. His talk tonight involves his new book, Paper Bullets, which was longlisted for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction. He's a sought-after public speaker and commentator who's appeared in documentary films, on television, and has been interviewed on radio and podcasts. Dr. Jackson received his BS in history summa cum laude with high honors from Vanderbilt University and a PhD in history from the University of Rochester. As a student and teacher of history, I am most impressed that he won the prestigious Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Research, Rhodes's highest honor for faculty. Joining Professor Jackson, we have Emily Yellin, a journalist, author, and producer who led a multimedia journalism project called Striking Voices, centered on interviews with Memphis sanitation workers and families who went on strike in 1968. From that project, she produced a 10-part video series called 1,300 Men, Memphis Strike 68. Emily's a longtime contributor to the New York Times, mostly writing about the South, race, and women's issues. She's the author of 2 fascinating books, and I encourage you to buy both of tonight's speakers' books. I do want to alert you that next Tuesday evening, December the 8th at 6 o'clock, we will welcome John Grisham and Cassandra King to discuss his latest book, A Time for Healing. But for now, I know that you will enjoy tonight's discussion with Jeffrey Jackson and Emily Yellin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Anne Dutch. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. We're both in Memphis, and we're teleporting to Charleston, right?
That's right, and I'm so glad that the Charleston Library Society invited us to participate tonight. It's a great honor. I wish we could be in the beautiful reading room all together, but alas, in the age of Zoom, we're still all together, just in this virtual format.
Yes, yes, and I love Charleston, and I told everybody I covered a hurricane there once, but before it was really nice and the food was great, and the hurricane didn't hit Charleston. So we'll be quieter than that tonight. So I'm just excited to get to talk about your book. I got to read it way in advance, and I've been waiting for it to come out. So first of all, when did it come out? How are you? Is it fun? What's going on? Just briefly.
So it came out on November 10th of this year. What was that, a week after the election? So
Right.
a few people have paid attention in the midst of everything that's been going on. But it's been great in these last few weeks to be able to visit a lot of groups, both in the United States and overseas as well. I did an event in London just last week at the Holocaust Library there, the Wiener Holocaust Library. So I've been traveling and touring, talking about the book, doing some interviews, doing some events, giving some talks. And it's been great, and got a lot of great questions. And I know folks will be able to ask some questions tonight, sending them to Dutch in the chat.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things I want to clear up, because when you read a book and you read somebody's name, you might not know how to pronounce it, and so you sort of make up a pronunciation in your head when you're reading it. How do you pronounce the two women? Introduce the two women in your book, both their names and their pseudonyms, and especially how you pronounce their real name.
Yeah, and I'll tell a little bit about their background too,
Please.
and talking about their names. So this is a book about two amazing women. It's a story of persistence. It's a story of imagination in some really trying times. And so their names are Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe. They were both French artists. They grew up in the southern city of Nantes. They moved to Paris when they were in their 20s, in the 1920s, right after World War I. They became part of the Paris art scene. And right before they moved to Paris, they took on some new names, these new artistic names. So Lucy Schwob became, in French, her name is pronounced Claude Cahun. Most English speakers, especially in the United States, tend to pronounce it Claude Cahun, which is not phonetically correct in French, but we'll just use Claude Cahun tonight because it's sort of easier to say than Claude Cahun
I might
for
just use
English
first
speakers.
name.
Yeah, whatever you want to use. And then Suzanne Malherbe took on a new artistic name as well. Her new name was Marcel Moore. And so it's possible that some folks listening tonight might have heard of them by these artistic names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. If you see any of their work, especially their photography, because they are nowadays, they're sort of known for this very kind of surrealist, in some cases sort of shocking photography that they did, a really experimental photography in the 1920s and 1930s. If you've ever seen it, in a gallery or in a museum, or if you've Googled it, and some folks might Google it, you can find some on my website too. It's usually credited to Claude Cahun, Lucy. It's usually not credited to both of them for a lot of complicated reasons that I'm still trying to figure out. But really, it was collaborative work. It was work that they both did together. So they were artists. They were collaborators in this artistic work. I mean, Lucy really was a writer and Suzanne really was an illustrator, but this photography was the work that they were able to do together. And they worked together for their whole lives. And they were also a couple. They were in love, they were a lesbian couple, and really their art and their lives were completely intertwined. And so they spent some amazing years in Paris getting to know Picasso and Salvador Dali and other folks that were in that Parisian creative scene.
Gertrude Stein, right?
Gertrude Stein, that's right. They were part of her circle as well.
Stein, right?
That's right. André Breton, the other surrealists. So all of the who's who folks in Paris, they opened their house, their apartment to folks, and they had a sort of their own salon where they invited people to come in and talk and meet and so forth. And then they went to other places and met people. So they were very much a part of that scene, and yet not as well known today. I mean, there was a long period of time where they were essentially forgotten. They were really sort of only rediscovered in the 1980s. So they're not really written about in those histories of those years.
And their work, well, one of the things I like is, I guess, David Bowie even saw their work and was impressed by it, didn't he? Isn't there something about that?
That's right. I sometimes joke that one of the great professional accomplishments at this point in my life now is that I've been able to quote David Bowie in my published work. He wrote in a blog post that he wrote in the early 2000s of some of the work of theirs that he saw. And I think the quote was something like, I find this work really quite mad in the best way, or something like that. Right. So he was very impressed. And of course, Bowie known for his kind of gender ambiguity and boundary crossing when it came to cross-dressing and gender lines. That was something that Lucy and Suzanne, as Cahun and Moore, were doing in these photographs. That's part of why a lot of people found them shocking, is that they were really sort of playing with categories of gender and sexuality and identity. Lucy, as Claude Cahun, was often dressing in men's clothing. In these photographs, they were dressing up in various costumes and really just kind of challenging, cutting hair really short. At one point, Lucy shaves her head. So a lot of the photographs of her, you can't really tell. Is she a man? Is she a woman? Is she young? Is she old? I mean, it's very sort of confusing in a lot of ways. And I think that confusion was intentional. And then what they would do is take a lot of these photographs and cut them up and make photo montage. So when Lucy published a book in 1930, a kind of memoir of her early years, It's a very surrealist, kind of strange, dreamlike autobiography. They include these amazing photo montage, and this is one of the things that they're known for. Again, folks can search for these images on the web; they're very easy to find, and they're really, kind of in some cases disturbing,
Right.
in some cases just sort of confusing. But they really kind of express, I think, something about the exploration that both of them were doing as women trying to find themselves, trying to understand their sexuality at a time when people didn't think about sexuality and identity in quite the same way we do now. So there was
Right.
a lot of exploration they were doing.
Yeah, and I think when you do look at the art, it does seem kind of familiar, but
Mhm.
that's because they were so early on in doing the kind of art that now seems normal, or is we understand a lot about what it is and what it's trying to convey. But back then, Paris was very much on the cutting edge in terms of art, and I mean, I think the avant-garde art in Paris in the early 20th century is something, is that, am
Absolutely.
I right? I mean, I'm not an artist. I know 5 minutes about everything. I know that.
No, I think you're right, and I think that's part of why they moved there. As I said, they grew up in the southern part of France, and they moved to Paris because they want to be part of that scene. And also,
Right.
people from all over the world are moving there. I mean, Picasso moves there from Spain. Other people from other parts of the world. A lot of Americans, of course, go to Paris in that same period in the 20s, and they meet those folks. Gertrude Stein, like you mentioned. And so it's definitely the place to be. It's a place where they're able to meet and explore new ideas. And I think part of what they're also doing, and this is kind of what I talk about in the book, is that they're in those years, they're beginning to establish patterns of resistance. Basically,
Right.
they're learning about how to challenge ideas, how to push back against the system, how to ask questions about, why are things this way? And they also get politicized in Paris in the 1920s, 1930s. So, there are a couple things that are happening. One is that in 1922, Mussolini comes to power. And then in
Right.
1933, Hitler comes to power. So they're aware of the political situation. They are involved in politics. They're talking with people about politics. They know what's happening. French politics becomes very polarized. In fact, that's part of why they leave Paris, is because there are literally people fighting in the streets over political issues in
I
Paris
hate
by
to
the mid
say, but
30s.
that sounds a little familiar, doesn't it?
It does, and it's part of what leads them to say enough, And Lucy also has chronic health issues, and so they begin to think about escaping. And yet at the same time, like I say, they're also politicized because a lot of the artists that they are hanging out with are also involved in left-wing politics. A lot of them are members of the Communist Party, and communism is really seen at that era very much as a bulwark against fascism. And so they're engaged in all of these political debates. And also part of the question that they're thinking about is, how can art be political? How can art be a way of expressing political views? So later on, when they resist the Nazis, when they are out of Paris and they're engaged in their anti-Nazi work, they're taking a lot of the skills and a lot of the thoughts and a lot of the kinds of things that they've been thinking about now for a number of years. They take those with them.
Yeah, and it primes them in a way, no pun intended, but um, you know, and I think, that's something you and I have talked about with this, is this idea of this lifelong arc of resistance, because we're going to get to the paper bullets part in a second, but I just wanted to establish this because I think a lot of times, particularly women, they'll do one thing and that's noted. Betsy Ross sewed a flag, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's all we know. And I think that for them to have had to kind of, well, I mean, they were in Paris where they were able to nurture who they were instead of hide. And so then when they go somewhere else and in effect have to kind of hide again, they're so strong within themselves that it's not as, well, I'm projecting, but maybe it's not as oppressive, and they're using it. And so I just think that's really fascinating, because you don't suddenly at whatever in your 50s in the Channel Islands become a resistance worker. I think it has to be
Right.
something that is an arc in your life. Can you just maybe take us now from Paris, and in the sense of how they as human beings kind of went through this, not necessarily with all the political context. I think that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, and I think it's not an easy story
No.
because even though, as you say, they are very strong and they find that strength and they tap into that strength, it's not something that they just sort of go, from the beginning and say, let's do it. There's a lot of debate between the two of them. In a lot of ways, when you write, as when you write about people like this, even people from the past, you really start to feel like you get to know them. And one of the things that I felt a lot about Lucy, and found lots of descriptions about this too. She was kind of the quieter one, the shyer one. She was less social, more introverted, more introspective. And yet what's interesting is that she was the one who was in many ways the more political one, the one who really wanted to do more political work. Suzanne was the one who was the more kind of feet on the ground, more practical, kind of ran the household, much more kind of, down to earth, so to speak. And yet she was also the one, and maybe this was her pragmatism, was the one who was a little more hesitant to get involved in some of those things. So even, and that even started with the decision to move from Paris to Jersey. So Jersey is one of the Channel Islands. It's just off the coast of France, but it's British territory. It's British soil. It's loyal to the British crown. They had vacationed there for many years. It was a familiar place to them. They had been there with family members in the past, and the two of them had been there many times over the years. And so when Paris became so politically difficult, and with Lucy's chronic health issues, they just decided that they needed a change. Suzanne's mother had recently passed away. They'd come into some additional money. I mean, they'd always come from money. I mean, they were daughters of wealth and privilege. I mean, their families were wealthy. But this new inheritance allowed them to make the move. But even then, it wasn't an automatic thing. They had to sort of think about, what are we going to do? How do we do this? And so eventually, through some debate and through some wrangling, they decide we'll move to Jersey. And they think that they're going to have a quiet life there. They think it will be a good place for Lucy to sort of recuperate. It will be a good place to just sort of live out our days and do our art and garden and just enjoy life.
I think it's interesting. They, all these things, but they're, mother and father married, so they were actually stepsisters.
That's right.
And so they were able to tell people, which is the classic thing, oh, we're sisters,
right. That's
or we're
right.
cousins or something. So they weren't necessarily suspect for living together.
That's right. And thank you for reminding me. That's another wrinkle in the whole story, that so not only are they a couple, but you're right, they are also stepsisters. It's Lucy's divorced father marries Suzanne's widowed mother in 1917. So they're already together as a couple by this point, but then they become stepsisters. And so yeah, once they move to Jersey, they do, as you say, they do sort of have the perfect cover. Paris was a little bit more open to a lesbian couple. They're a little bit more accepting, not totally, but more so. Jersey, much less so. So
Right.
Having that cover was very convenient. And they hire a maid and they sort of set up house. They buy a granite farmhouse right on the beach. They can look out onto this beautiful beach. In Jersey, I spent some time on Jersey doing the research for this book, and I can understand why they would want to go. It's a beautiful, lovely island. There's palm trees. It's temperate. It's it's a beautiful place, and a lot of the streets, little winding streets, look very much like a European city or Parisian city. And a lot of the names on the street names and family names on Jersey were actually from old French families that had migrated there centuries before. So you could hear English and French both spoken in the streets.
And it's got more French influence, but it is truly English.
Right.
It's part of the United Kingdom in that way. But I told you this earlier, I call it kind of an odd occupation, because
Right.
we think that Britain was not occupied, and it wasn't necessarily, because why? Why isn't it Britain in the war?
That's right. And that's one of the surprising aspects of this story. Sometimes when I talk about this, a lot of people say, I didn't know anything about the occupation of the Channel Islands, or I didn't know that there was any part of Britain that was occupied by the German army during the war. But in 1940, the German army arrives on the Channel Islands, and it is the only part of British soil that's occupied by the German army. It's right off the coast of France. It's much closer to France than it is to Britain geographically. Part of why they do this is because it's strategically important. The Germans basically start, after a year or so into the war, they start constructing what they call their Atlantic Wall. And it's not a literal wall, but it's a series of fortifications along the coast of Europe. And the idea is to defend the continent that they've conquered from Allied attack. And so the Channel Islands actually become one of the most important parts of that Atlantic Wall. So there are thousands of soldiers that are stationed on these 7 Channel Islands. The 2 biggest are Jersey and Guernsey. But there are thousands of troops that are stationed there, and they bring slave laborers from the east to construct fortifications, to construct artillery stations, and so they construct tunnels all over the islands. So it becomes this really strategically important zone for the Germans. For Lucy and Suzanne, that then presents an opportunity. What are we going to do? Are we going to stand by and just sort of watch this happen? Or are we going to, like we were talking about that arc of their resistance, are we going to get involved? And that was another place where they debated. It wasn't something that they just immediately jump into it. They have, and I talk about this in the book, they have some really serious conversations with one another about, do we want to do this? What should we do? And they start off small. And over time,
interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people left and went to England. A lot of the people who lived in the Channel Islands, right?
That's right.
They were given that option and they chose not to.
That's right. And they said that they thought about it. They thought about maybe going to England, where they also had some ties and some connections.
But they were French. So.
They were French, and they thought about going back to France, even though it was occupied. But they didn't really know, what they would do at either of these places. Jersey was their home now, and
So
they sort of felt like it was, once they make the decision to engage in some kind of resistance, the way Lucy ends up talking about it after the war, she's reflecting back on it. She says, really, it was only in Jersey that we realized we had the luxury of resistance there, because if we had gone somewhere else, we probably wouldn't have been able to do this work. So, she becomes the one who sort of pushes this agenda of let's do something. And it's interesting that I always found that phrase interesting, the way she talks about it as a luxury, the luxury of resistance.
Meaning that what do you think she means by that?
I think what she meant by that was that if they had gone back to France, they really would have had to sort of kept quiet, maybe gone underground. They wouldn't have worked, because they also say that when they engage in this resistance work that they do with the paper bullets that we're coming to, we'll talk about, describe what that is, that they don't want to involve anybody else. They want to do it on their own because they don't want to put anyone else at risk.
Right.
And so there's this kind of sense that we're on our own on Jersey, we're independent, and we have this almost kind of captive audience. There are these thousands of German soldiers here, and we can sort of communicate with them in a way that maybe we couldn't do that if we were back in France, or certainly if they were in Britain, they couldn't have done that. But communicating with the Germans becomes their way of resistance.
Right. I'll ask you one more question before we get to the paper bullets.
Okay.
And this is a little bit personal, not terribly, but for me, one of the things that strikes me is Lucy is half Jewish. Her father is Jewish, but she was not raised Jewish. She technically, in Judaism, she's not, because her mother isn't.
Right.
And she doesn't necessarily identify as being Jewish. And I actually have that exact same circumstance in my life. I don't identify, but my grandparents came here from Poland. And I think it's interesting because she does have a stake in this. And I sometimes say, I'm not Jewish unless somebody's being anti-Semitic. Then I feel very Jewish. And I feel like that's something that I identify with. And so I wonder, she didn't really have to, or she didn't have Judaism as part of her life, but I wonder if when the anti-Semitism arose, she felt it more. Might that be true?
I think that's absolutely right. In a couple of senses. I mean, in one sense, you're right that she's not raised Jewish, but she does have a grandmother who talks to her about her Jewish heritage. I mean, there were some rabbis in the family, some scholars of Jewish life, and this was a grandmother that she was close to. And so her grandmother did sort of inculcate certain aspects, of at least the family's heritage to her. But the other thing that's really sort of a definitive moment for her, and she's very young when this happens, but it's the outbreak of the Dreyfus affair in France. And some folks listening may be familiar with the Dreyfus affair, and it's very complicated. We can't go into all the details here, but it's this incredibly important massive anti-Semitic episode that happens in France in the late 19th century. And so she's only 4 years old when this happens, but her father takes the side of Dreyfus. So Dreyfus, the short version of this is that Dreyfus is a captain in the French army, and he's accused of giving the German army military secrets. And that's not true, it's false. But basically all of France gets divided over this question of whether Dreyfus is guilty or innocent. So
And he was Jewish?
He was Jewish, yes. And so he was an easy scapegoat. He was seen as a sort of, well, let's blame it on, you know, this Jewish military officer, because it's easy to see him as an outsider, so to speak. Because a lot of people in France thought about Jews as outsiders. So Lucy's father had actually gone to school with Dreyfus, and her father was also a newspaper editor, and a lot of intellectuals and a lot of other people too took stands on this issue. And so her father supported Dreyfus in his case and basically said he's innocent. And that led to crowds of people outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." People who were opposed to Dreyfus, who thought he was guilty, who thought he had done this and betrayed France to the German army. So again, it's a very complicated story, but the point is that, you know, Lucy herself experienced that. And then there was another episode when she was a little bit older where she was actually pelted with rocks on the playground at school, and taunted with anti-Semitic taunts. So even though she didn't embrace or she didn't practice Judaism, as you say, I mean, it was sort of thrust upon her, right? Mm-hmm. And so that sense that, and so I think then for her, it became something that in some ways she did kind of take on elements of a Jewish identity, but because it was a way for her to kind of identify as an outsider, as somebody, you know, I'm not part of this mainstream. I'm not, you know, I think it contributed to her rebelliousness in a way, or to her ability to and desire to resist. Right. And then, of course, it was something that, you know, inspired her to fight against fascism.
Right. And I mean, you know, there's anti-Semitism, anti-gay sentiment, misogyny, so many things. You know, they're not mothers, they're artists, they're elites, there are all these things. So let's get to the moment, but I don't want you to give it all away.
Okay.
So just tell us a little bit, because I want people to read this book.
Right.
But tell us what the paper bullets were, and you know why they're called that.
Okay. So when they decide to do something, when they decide to resist in some way on Jersey, starting in late 1940. They begin small. And the first thing that they do is they come up with a sort of slogan. And that slogan is the German phrase ohne Ende, which means without end. And they write that, they graffiti it on walls, and they write it on little newspaper or slips of paper or cigarette packets, and they leave it around for Germans to find. And basically what they're trying to do with this little jingle is to say to the Germans, this is a war without end, right? Ohne Ende, without end.
You're going to be fighting this forever.
That's right. And what they're really trying to say to the German soldiers is that you're the victims here, right? I mean, you've been fooled by Hitler into this endless war, and look who's going to pay the price. You know, it's you. So they start small with that, but then it begins to grow, and it begins to turn into a much more sophisticated campaign of, and I talk about it in the book as a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, where they essentially are trying to get inside the minds of the German soldiers to demoralize them and make them think about, why are we here on Jersey? What are we really doing here? So they start writing notes, not just this little slogan, but they write poems, they write songs, they write bawdy jokes with Hitler in German. Because Suzanne is fluent in German. And so they write, like I said, bawdy jokes with Hitler as the butt of the joke. Or they write some fictional dialogue, you know, two soldiers talking to one another. And they write hundreds of these notes. And then they also listen to the BBC with their secret radio, their illegal radio, and they summarize BBC news reports in German and slip them also to the German soldiers. And they would leave these notes around the island. They would pin them to a fence post, or they would tuck them into a German staff car. Sometimes they would even slip them into the pockets of German soldiers as they were walking down the street, or they'd leave them on a cafe table, or they would put them in a magazine at the newsstand, a German language magazine that was on sale for the soldiers to buy. So by leaving all of these messages around, they were doing a couple of things. First of all, they were getting this alternative message, right? A message that was different than what the German army was saying, different than what Hitler was saying. But they were also, you know, getting inside the heads of the soldiers, because they would sign these notes with this fictional persona that they'd created. So they created this persona called the soldier with no name. So they were essentially pretending to be a German soldier, writing from his perspective, and essentially making the German army think that there was a conspiracy within their own ranks. And they really,
which is pretty much the exact direct opposite of who they are, which is fairly.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right. I mean, I talk about this sort of as another example sort of their cross-dressing, so to speak, right? I mean, they're doing this in Paris in their photographs. They're playing with gender identity in their photographs. They're doing the same thing here by crossing a gender boundary from being two women to being this fictional German soldier, and sort of taking on his authority, so to speak, right? And the idea being that if other soldiers read these notes written by this fictional soldier with no name, they would think, you know, oh my gosh, there are other people in the army who are also doubting what we're doing here, and who are also having second thoughts. And so the idea was to really make people doubt and to think about what they were doing. And they were, you know, the secret field police, which was the organization tasked with keeping order in occupied territories, they would find these notes too, and they started hunting for this fictional soldier with no name. They wanted to know who was writing these notes, because they realized that it really would have the effect of demoralizing the soldiers. And again, this is in this very strategic location where they're building this fortification to try to prevent Allied attack. So
do you think it did work?
I think it did. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, for one thing, the secret field police chases them for 4 years. And I don't think that the police would have done that if it was just sort of like, oh, well, these notes don't matter. It's, you know, this is just silliness. I think that the police took it very seriously. And then ultimately when they're put on trial, I mean, they're sentenced to death for this, right? It's not something that's dismissed, you know, out of hand. But they also end up, when they're in prison, they spend 8 months in prison for this. And they do end up meeting men who had read their notes. And so, you know, they don't drive the Germans out of Jersey. They don't, you know, the German army doesn't suddenly one day pack up and go home. But it's clear that they're having an impact, that they're really sort of making people, you know, think about what's the morality of what we're doing here? Why am I not at home with my family and my children and protecting them instead of over here occupying these people?
And that's the thing with resistance, you know, it's not combat. You know, you're not actually in combat trying to win a war. You're actually trying to resist the oppression that sort of comes with either occupation or what you're fighting against, that sort of thing. And so I think one of the things, you know, we touched on it a little bit, and I definitely don't want to go here, but there's so many parallels to now. And when you said a wall and you know, fascism, I had some thoughts, but again, we will not go there. But I think the other piece of this that really struck me is so many times in war, and you and I have talked about this as well, we've had a lot of coffees together, or a couple of coffees together, but the idea that they were old women, let's just say it that way, and even any kind of woman can be underestimated, and especially then in these kinds of situations, because war was really men's work, you know. And so women, it was like the women and children are separate. Less so now, partly because of women like them who pioneered and showed what you're missing when you underestimate women. But I think that's another part of this, is this idea. I mean, they were really primed from so much of their lives. And even the fact, honestly, that they were wealthy and they'd grown up that way, they had a sense of maybe entitlement or exception to the rules that I think all came together in this way that motivated them. Would that be accurate?
I think so. I mean, I really feel like, again, you know, like I said, you kind of get to know people when you write this kind of work and you study them for so long. But I do feel like that for them, it was the outgrowth of their relationship, their love story, their partnership. It was the outgrowth of their art. But it was also the outgrowth of their life experience too. I mean, one of the things that they talk about, for example, is that when they're in prison and they're dealing with the guards and they're dealing with the trial and so forth, they say that, you know, we're not afraid of soldiers because we know what soldiers are like, because our brothers and cousins were officers in the French army during World War I. And so there's this kind of sense that that they're not going to be put off by, you know, by the German army and all the trappings and everything, because they what they are able to end up doing is to see, they see these soldiers who've arrested them and are holding them in prison, they see them as humans. They don't see them as, I mean, they reject what they stand for, but they still see their humanity in this. And I sometimes talk about what they're doing with these notes in a way almost as a kind of act of rescue. I think they see themselves almost rescuing these soldiers because they are trying to rewrite the script, you know, flip the script. You know, Hitler has this narrative about, you know, why we're doing this, why we're conquerors, you know, we're building a master race, we're conquering the world. Their script is one, is a totally different one, right? And I think they see themselves as trying to rescue these men from going into battle and dying, rescue them from the falseness and the lies that they would say that Hitler has been spinning, and that so that somehow the soldiers are victims in their own way. And so for them, I think it's, you know, all of those things kind of coming together: family experiences, life experiences, their own, you know, their own experiences as outsiders. It really kind of gels in this resistance work that they do.
Yeah, and the fact that they directed it at the soldiers and not at civilians, a lot of psyops, as I understand it, you know, are directed at civilians. Like there were leaflets dropped on the British citizens, for instance, you know. So the idea is they're directing it at the soldiers, which is a different kind of work. To bring up the book I wrote about women in World War II, American women, there were American women who participated in that. And we were talking about this as, you know, people might have heard of Tokyo Rose, who was an American woman who got caught in Japan during World War II and was kind of made to do these radio broadcasts to the American soldiers. And then in Germany, there was an American woman who fell in love with a professor and went to Germany and believed in the German cause, and she was called Axis Sally, and she broadcast to American soldiers in Europe. And so it's an interesting kind of piece of this, and it's women who are doing it either willingly or not, you know. Why do you think, maybe well, let me say what I think, and then
I want to hear your perspective on it. And can I also hold up your book just so everybody can see?
Oh, sure.
Our Mother's War, which is a great book.
Wait, hold up the other side, because it's my mom.
Oh, that's right. There's your mom on the back.
That's my mom. She was in Saipan during World War II. And she actually heard Tokyo Rose. I have that in the book. She wrote a letter home to her parents because she heard Tokyo Rose, and she thought it was, you know, they thought it was funny. So there's that, because, you know, they were saying ridiculous things and they knew it was propaganda. But you know, I think it's more interesting in a way that these men didn't know that this was propaganda. So there's a different thing there. But wait, what was I going to say?
You were talking about the role of women in war and sort of what they're able to do.
Yeah.
What they're able to achieve, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is, I think that women are underestimated in a lot of these things. And like I said, war is men's work. And so women aren't allowed to do a lot of the things that are part of war until World War II, in America anyway. And so I think this was the 20th century where a lot of women's roles were changing all over the Western world in particular, you know. Does that play into this? I mean, the fact, like, this wouldn't have necessarily happened in, you know, 1840, would it?
Probably not. Certainly not in the same way. But I think you're absolutely right that one of the things that enables them to do this work is precisely the fact that the German army doesn't expect, this is not what they expect from women. And so women are able to sort of fly under the radar and do certain kinds of things. And this is also true of the French resistance as well. I mean,
Right.
Lucy and Suzanne are French, yet they're not talked about in stories of the French resistance because, of course, they're in Jersey when this is happening. But when I looked at accounts of the French resistance, women actually play a very important role in the French resistance in France, doing the kinds of things that in some ways are kind of parallel to this, housing people, doing the laundry for resistance, for male resistance fighters, cooking their food, storing weapons, smuggling notes, smuggling supplies for the men, or in some cases, a woman who maybe works in an office as a secretary is able to steal some paper, right, that gets used to write notes on official letterhead. And this is what's going on in France. So there are a number of kinds of things that women are able to do to sort of use their position and to use gender expectations about what women can and cannot do or should and shouldn't do. And they sort of flip it around and use it to their advantage. And I think Lucy and Suzanne are doing something kind of similar here too, that they're able to go about this in part because they seem innocuous. They're not the sort of people that you would expect to mastermind a 4-year psyops campaign of note writing, and
unless
certainly
you
not
know who they are. Yeah.
unless you know who they are. And even the people on Jersey who were their neighbors and friends didn't really know about their Parisian life. I think they kept a lot of that private, and so people just saw them as these kind of eccentric French women who had moved to Jersey, and they mostly kept to themselves. I mean, they did have some friends and neighbors, but by and large, they were sort of on their own. And so, and they certainly didn't involve anyone else in this note writing. I mean, this was something they did on their own, and really only one person knew about this. They did have one friend who they told about this. It was a longtime friend, somebody who lived on Jersey. They had met her many years before on vacations that they had taken. And they were the only person, she was the only person that they let in on the secret. Even their maid didn't know, and her husband who lived in the house, right? Their maid and her husband lived in this big house that they bought. They didn't even know what was going on. So they really wanted to protect other people from getting in trouble. And so, so all of this, I think it was at least in part made possible by the fact that they, as women, they were able to defy expectations.
Right. There's a woman in my book named Virginia Hall, an American woman, and she dressed up as an old lady. She was 37 years old, but she dressed up as a very old lady, and she changed her name too. I wrote it down to remember. Marcel Montaigne, I think. And it's funny, it's Marcel as well, but the Germans called her one of the best spies ever because they same thing, they just couldn't find her. They had no idea. And so I think this idea of using the kind of underestimation against people is something that I will say I think a lot of women know about already,
Right.
And a lot of people who are marginalized in other ways, know about. But it's, I think, a really fascinating part of this book too, to look at it from that lens, And what about for you? What brought you to this book?
So, speaking of the important role of women, I give my wife full credit for for telling me about this story. My wife is an art historian and has taught about the history of photography for many years and knew about the photographs, so knew about the work under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and taught their photographs in her class. And one night we were discussing, I don't even know how this came up, but we were talking about things, and she said, you should really look at these people. They're really interesting. And she said, I think somehow they defied the Nazis. She didn't know much about that part of the story, but she knew a little bit, enough to sort of pique my interest. So I started looking at the photographs. And so initially the photographs are what drew me in. And you look at them and they're amazing and they're interesting. And like I said, they're surprising and there's all this kind of stuff going on. But then as I started to look at and to try to find out more about the anti-Nazi resistance story, I realized that very little had been written about it. A little bit here, a little bit there, a chapter here, an article there, a paragraph in a book, a biography, but not very much. And so that was why I wanted to really dig into that. And then as I did, that's when I really started to see the link, right? The link between the art that they did and the resistance work that they did, because their art is another form of resistance. And so it's just, they take those same skills as artists and they become, they turn that into their creativity into the work that they do against the Nazis. So for me, that was kind of the intellectual journey that this book has taken me on.
And there is a pertinence. I think if we might be getting to questions soon, but from our audience, but there is a pertinence to today. I mean, we talked about that initially, like how, you know, what's going on in America, not just in politics, but also, you know, in social justice and all of that resistance now, and the way people are trying to express that, you know, that really, I think this really is informative and relevant to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one thing that this shows us is that, you know, there are many ways to have your voice heard. There are many ways to speak out. I think a lot of people, you know, feel like, well, if I'm not out in the streets, you know, putting my life on the line or risking life and limb, then somehow I'm not really resisting. But that's not necessarily the case. There are lots of ways to go about that. And as you alluded to earlier, I mean, resistance is, it's a kind of way of life. It's a kind of, you know, it's pushing. It's not always sort of, you know, violent striking or you know, lightning strike, right? Sometimes it's a slow act, right? It's a form of slow politics, right? That may take years. I mean, in their case, it took 4 years. For other people, it takes 50 years, or it takes a lifetime, you know, that you live out that kind of resistance. And it can be in the things you say, it can be in the patterns of your living. And that's what I think, you know, again, for me, that's why their lives, it is a kind of long arc. You know, it's not just, they don't wake up one day and say, let's resist. It's something they've cultivated. And I think that's true of a lot of other people who do, in the war, for example, who do become resistors. A lot of those people are people who have been involved in something earlier on that leads them to that. I mean, some people may have a sort of road to Damascus moment where they just sort of one day say, let's do it, you know, let's resist. But for most people who were involved in resistance in some way, it was part of a lifelong or a many years long pattern. And I think that maybe that's something that folks can take away from this today too.
Yeah. And, you know, I always said about the women in World War II, the American women, I called it an inadvertent revolution, because there were so many places where women were, I use the word aloud in quotes, to do things that they hadn't been before. It was the first time women were in the military, were allowed. It was the first time women had the right to vote during a war. So it was the first time that women were in Congress. There was one woman in the cabinet at the time, the labor secretary. So a lot of the changes, and in fact, the reason women were allowed to fight in the war was because there were women in the Congress. So I think that's how revolution happens too. You know, it's not always these epic moments. It's all these little things and all these things. And that's why the idea of people participating and being a part of, you know, this, and in whatever way you can. And I think this is such a great example of that, you know.
Well, and it makes me think too of your own work too, and other people who've worked on civil rights struggles here in Memphis and other places, you know, that a lot of folks have realized that, you know, sometimes the narrative we tell about the civil rights movement, the old narrative is this kind of top-down narrative that, you know, leaders like King and others sort of come in and just sort of save the day. But really, the people who were working hard, it was the people at ground level. It was the people who were doing grassroots work, sometimes for years and years and years, to lay the groundwork and to build on things, and the kind of back and forth between leaders, national leaders, and local efforts that was really making something like the civil rights movement work. And I think, you know, it's not an exact parallel, but what attracted me to this story was precisely this idea that this is ground level, you know. And what happens when you look at resistance at ground level, and what happens when you look at World War II at ground level? You know, we know the big dramatic stories of the war. We know the big, you know, the battles. And this is a battle too, but it's a small local battle. But yet, when you look at it, it adds some real texture and a different way of thinking about how the war plays out in a different battlefront than most people are aware of. And to think about, you know, this is not the sort of drama of a huge battle, but it's a slow drip. It's the day-to-day living out of that practice of resistance.
I think it's also the strategy. You know, there's a strategy to it. And so it's not just something they did for, you know, maybe it'll work. They had a strategy and they built it. And I think it's also a really great example of nonviolent strategy, right? And that was certainly the strategy of the civil rights movement. You know, that's something that people don't don't really always recognize is there were strategists and there were nonviolent strategists, which is my secret project, but I'm not going to talk about right now, that I'm working on. So
you can tell me later when we're offline.
Yeah, I'll tell you later, and then maybe, you know, in 2 years I can come back to the library and talk about it.
Right, exactly.
So
well,
anyway.
do we have some questions? Maybe
Yeah.
we're getting close to the end, so some questions if they're out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Emily, I just want to thank you for those. Those were some incredible questions for Jeffrey. And
Definitely.
Jeff, we do have some pretty good ones rolling in right now. A few people are interested in how you researched this material and where you got the most for it.
Right, and that's a great question, and it's a complicated story, so I'll give sort of the short version of this. So there are a couple of places, archival, a lot of archival work went into this. So I spent some time in Jersey, in the Jersey Trust, which is a wonderful local archive in Jersey. Some of that archive has been digitized, and so I was able to work on that from home, but other parts of it were not, so I had to go there in person and actually look at the documents themselves. There's another cache of documents at Yale University, and their special collections library, so I spent some time at Yale as well, and looking at those. Also spent some time in London at the National Archives, looking in particular at military records, some declassified military intelligence records that were there about Jersey during the occupation. In addition to that, some of Lucy's work, again under this name, this artistic name, Claude Cahun, were published in the early 1990s. So some letters that she wrote, some of her kind of, I won't quite call it a memoir, but it's sort of like notes and sketches, and it's very difficult to know what you call it, but it's sort of ramblings almost at times. but it was published after after many years after she'd passed away, and so I was able to have access to that. So kind of putting all these pieces together and really, you know, transatlantic, pulling together archival and published sources. People have looked at bits and pieces of this before, these sources before, but I think I'm the first person to really cast the wide net and to pull it all together. Suzanne's documents are the ones primarily at Yale, and it was very interesting and very difficult to work with those documents because, you know, if you imagine a sheet of paper, sometimes it was the back of an envelope, sometimes it was the back of a calendar, sometimes it was just a blank sheet of paper. What she would do is she would write a few sentences and then she would draw a line. And then she'd write a few more sentences about their experience and then draw a line, and a few more sentences and draw a line. So basically she was just sort of going down the page and drawing up, but none of those sections had anything to do with each other. Yeah. It was almost like stream of consciousness, like I'm writing here and then a totally different thought, you know, over here. So I did this all virtually or with my camera. I'd take pictures of all these things and do an electronic cut and paste to literally sort of put them together like a puzzle. So over here she'd be talking about an interrogation, and over here she'd be talking about an interrogation. And so I would take those two images and put them together in my file so that I could read it as though it were a straight narrative, and then do a lot of other piecing together. So it was. I sometimes have talked about this, that I think this is probably the hardest book that I've had to write, to sort of do that kind of piecing together. I mean, it's always difficult to do archival research, but this one had a lot of extra challenges.
So you would say that the Lucy and Suzanne's, that would you call them personal journals or scrapbooks of sorts? It's sort of those were kind of the premier source where you could get to see their thoughts and their actions put into place in these kind of journals that maybe also kind of ran parallel to their paper bullets.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what to call them. If they were, I wouldn't really call them journals in the traditional sense of that. You know, it was clear that they were sketching out some thoughts that maybe they were going to publish this down the road, because sometimes it would be the same story told 2 or 3 times with slightly different variations. But scrapbook, I've seen people refer to it as a scrapbook. That's one way to do it or to talk about it. But lots of bits and pieces. Also, some of their correspondence from the war, and of course some of the notes themselves. So it was just a lot of material to sort through. And like I said, archival work is always very challenging, but this had some unique challenges to it as well.
Awesome. So this is an interesting question. So in today's social media centric world, do you think that the two women, the artists, their propaganda artistry would have been enhanced or diluted? And what else might they have added to their media mix?
That's an amazing question. Because in some ways, somebody I was talking to about this likened these notes to like internet memes, that sort of put this message out there, like it was a meme, would circulate. You could also maybe say that these were kind of like tweets too, right? That they were these little messages because they were always very short. For the most part, they were very short. And the idea was that they would circulate, and actually they would often write at the bottom of the note, please distribute. So the idea was that if a soldier who was sympathetic to the message read the note, maybe he would pass it on to somebody else. Like today, of course, we would say retweet, right? So it's almost like a funny kind of precursor to that. So they were definitely, aware of how ideas circulate and how to catch people's attention. And I think that goes back to their training as artists and their work as artists. And even some of Lucy wrote a kind of theoretical piece about how art can function. And she basically says, propaganda doesn't work because it's too obvious. It has to be something, she calls it the indirect effect. It has to be something that you don't immediately recognize as propaganda, but something that works its way into the thinking of a person. So, in today's world, I don't know exactly what they would do, but I think they would use every strategy that they could, because they did also make some photo montage. They did use some of not their own photography, but they would like cut up magazines and make some interesting kind of designs and things and slip those in and take letters and cut them out. So they would do all sorts of things. And I think they would do, as much of that today. I mean, imagine the two of them with Photoshop, or with the ability to do some kind of cut and paste or Instagram. I mean, it would be amazing. I don't know what it would look like, but it would be amazing.
Yeah. So I'm interested. So we talked before about these acts of rebellion that they're creating. To me, they're compassion driven. So they were appealing to the better nature of these soldiers. And do you think that has anything to do with them being marginalized in so many different facets at the time, that they were so successful with the psyops because they were on the outside? So they knew how to navigate those back channels and to choose the right path to, like you said, that indirect propaganda through. So it's like connecting with someone's heart and connecting with someone's true sense of being versus just connecting with a soldier.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. And I think that's certainly part of it. I think the idea that they saw themselves as outsiders and experienced that, like as I was describing before about the anti-Semitism, I mean, they certainly, lived through that in many different ways. And then also, like I said, having had family members in the war and sort of understanding kind of where soldiers were coming from, that they were real people too, that they weren't, faceless others. But I also think there were lots of other sort of factors that worked into that. And it's hard to say exactly how they came to that, but I think I like the way you put that they really were sort of compassion driven. I think that this was something that for them, it was not an act of hatred. It was not, these were not notes saying, we hate you, go home. Instead, they were basically notes saying, you don't have to be here if you don't want to, kind of appealing to that aspect, and really sort of, in some cases, literally tugging at the heartstrings, because there would be a note, for example, that said, there was one that's something like, why can't Eric go home on leave to be with his family? They were literally evoking and very directly evoking images of family. And so I think, for them, the sense of connection, right? That in some ways they hadn't always had, except with each other, but they understood why that was so important for people, for the human connection. And so they were trying to make that connection to the men around them, and then to remind those men that you have families, you have other connections. Why are you here when you could be at home with your children and taking care of them and defending them and protecting them? So for me, it's like a combination of their background and also just their sort of, I think, wisdom about the human experience that led them to this strategy.
Wonderful. Well, Jeffrey and Emily, I just want to thank both of you for tonight. This has been wonderful. And I want to
Thanks for the invitation.
absolutely.
Yeah, it was great.
You're both welcome back here when when we're allowed to be in person. But I want to remind everyone that the book's available for sale through Buxton Books. The email that I sent out earlier today has the link in there to purchase. So if you're curious about these Lucy and Suzanne and you want to hear the full story and read the full story and see some of these paper bullets, I implore you to go purchase the book and read it. This has been wonderful. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly did. So I just want to thank you once more and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
It was a great Emily to talk to you
You too.
again, and thank you for all the great questions, and thanks Dutch for organizing this and inviting us. And I do want to just put in an extra word to say please support your local booksellers, your local independent booksellers.
Yeah.
So head off to the bookstore and
Buxton Books.
Buxton Books, that's right, and Paper Bullets and Our Mother's War by Emily Yellen.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
Both great reads.
Wonderful. Have a great night.
Great.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everybody.
Good night,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
Bye-bye.